Okay, hello and welcome everybody. Welcome to this next Center for International Higher Education seminar. I am Rebecca Schendel, I'm Managing Director of CIHE, and delighted to see you all here today, and delighted to have the chance to welcome our colleague Jonathan Jansen. So Professor Jansen is Distinguished Professor of Education at Stellenbosch University, and also the immediate past President of the Academy of Science of South Africa. He started his career, I believe, as a high school biology teacher, but over the years has a very distinguished career in higher education. He's held all the positions, head of department, dean, vice chancellor, all of the things, and now I hope he can just not worry so much about all of that and just do interesting research at this stage in his career. You may know Jonathan from a number of his books, Knowledge in the Blood, Corrupted, a study of chronic dysfunction in South African universities, and also the Decolonization of Knowledge. He's written prolifically, and I recommend all those books to you. And to our delight, Professor Jansen is the Chin Yidan Global Fellow at Harvard University this year, 2024, which means that he is here with us in Boston. So we're delighted to have him with us. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you very much.
There is a clicker here if you want to click.
Good to see all of you. Thank you for taking time. On such a beautiful day, the last thing I would do as a graduate student is sit in a dark room and listen to a dark guy, from the dark continent. Anyway, I'm not a distinguished professor at Stellenbosch University. My letter of appointment was written by HR and the women at Stellenbosch. Most people are Afrikaans speakers. So she got the word wrong, and she said, I am an extinguished professor. If I feel a little burnt out. So I'm living in a very expensive hotel. I feel really guilty as an African, the Charles Hotel. I mean, it's ridiculous. But anyway, so I explored the restaurants in the area last night. By the way, if you're looking for a good curry restaurant, in your part of the best one's a place called Maharaja.
Oh, yes.
Oh my gosh. Anyway, and so I sat down there last night for the umpteenth time. They see me and they know what I want, And there was a Kenyan, and the woman is from Kenya, the husband is from Tanzania, or vice versa. But they live in Canada. So they're sitting there, and the husband comes over to my table where I'm sitting alone, and he says, "It's so wonderful to meet you, Mr. Jones." Do you know who he's referring to? Who's Mr. Jones?
As in James Earl?
As in James Earl Jones. I get this all the time. It's either Forrest Whitaker or James Earl Jones, right? So he says, "So wonderful to meet you, Mr. Jones." And his wife then replies, "No, he died a few months ago." And so I'm caught between, is it me or anyway. I live a double life. In the mornings at 6:30, I get up and I drive to the most dysfunctional school in South Africa. And I work there from 6:30 till 1. And then I drive 40 kilometers east to Stellenbosch University, where I do what professors do, mentor students. Got about 12 postdocs, each of them are working on a different book project. What professors do. But the morning is an absolutely fascinating thing. The school had the worst results in the grade 12, what we call the matric exams, last year. And the only reason I went there in my 18-hour day is because the school is next to the family home in which I grew up. And so, I could hear my mother's voice from the grave saying, "What, sir?" No, what did my mother say? From the grave. I've worked in schools all over the country, in all 9 provinces. I've worked in different parts of the world with schools. What was she telling me from the grave? Because I didn't have time to go to the school. It starts with the word charity.
Wake up. Wake up and go. Wash your dishes. Go to school.
That's your mother.
We got the same mother, don't worry.
Oh, you see?
Charity
Begins at home.
begins at home. So you better go and work at this school. And so I showed up there. They were very happy to see me. And I worked there, and the school is so dysfunctional that after a week of sort of figuring out what was going on, I realized I went to the principal, her team. all the teachers, there's two things we need to do here. The one is to change the academic results of the school, which is quite easy. But the difficult one is changing the culture of the school, okay? And so I have to figure out how to change the culture. So we want to hear more about that story. Because after 9 months, the school's culture changed quite quickly, which worries me because it's not supposed to happen this fast. And just not supposed to. So I'm worried about what I'm not seeing. But from 1 o'clock, I work at the university doing stuff like this, okay? So in the mid-2000s, there was a dramatic explosion of student protests on South African campuses. We have 26 public universities, and most of this was on the historically white campuses, the old English campuses in particular. And it went under the name decolonization, which was a bit of a shock to me because we don't use that term. Zimbabwe used the term decolonization in its struggles. Algeria, France Fanon, decolonization. South Africa never talked about decolonization historically because white people weren't regarded as colonialists. They were regarded as citizens. They were incorporated as citizens. And so I was quite puzzled. Of all the language you could use, why the language of decolonization? Anyway, what you see here is probably when people refer to this hashtag movement called Rhodes Must Fall, RMF, they're referring to Cecil John Rhodes, whose statue used to sit very prominently on the campus of the University of Cape Town, where I live, near the university. And they basically demanded that the statue come down. And that sort of symbolized the decolonization moment in South Africa, the bringing down of this statue. The guy who started this off with threw human excrement on the statue, and it got a lot of attention for that. He now sees me once a week. This is now, of course, 2015. And I'm mentoring this young man and trying to get inside his head as to what he was thinking when all this happened. But in any event, at the time, just in case you're interested, there were some of us, I was one of those who said, why do you want to take this guy down? Okay, put a plaque on there, tell people about his role in the Imperial Project and so on. In other words, if you take him away, there's nothing to talk about. Well, of course, when you're angry, you can imagine. You wanted black students on this white campus, wanted him down, and so they took it down, it's disappeared, and we no longer talk about it. Which doesn't make any sense to me. Just so you know, around this time, similar movements are happening in other parts of the world. For example, the statue of a slaveholder in Bristol in the United Kingdom gets thrown in the river. Shortly after that, there's a moment, again in the UK, why is my curriculum so white? Quite a significant moment. At that time, the protest here around Rhodes went to a college at Oxford, again demanding that Rhodes come down and so on and so forth. And then after that, a couple of years later, you start to see in the US, for example, Confederate statues coming down. Of course, there is this horrific moment around the murder of George Floyd and so on. So, I've got one of my doctoral students who's making some connections between these different moments, particularly where they involve statues. The Belgians, who, when I go there, they didn't want to talk to me about King Leopold II. It was a vicious dude. But they've now, started to repatriate some of their museum pieces back to the Congo, which is not as easy as it sounds, as you can imagine. But nevertheless, at the heart of this moment is the South African student struggle. So, because I was trained to be suspicious of any sign of exuberance, whenever I see people excited about something, I tend as a social scientist to say, wait a minute, don't join this noise yet. Try and figure out what is going on, So just as a footnote, I grew up in a home of evangelical Christians. We were crazily evangelical, right? So I've always been fascinated by white evangelical history in the United States and why people who on the face of it, are sort of holy people who don't tolerate, any kind of mischief would support an imbecile like Trump. It just didn't make any sense to me, Now I know, okay, and I might talk about that if we have time. And now I understand what happened. And when that happens, then I'm calm. Then I'm, figured it out. So I was wondering, why the language of decolonization in South Africa, and given that it wasn't clear to me what the colonial project was. I mean, I could understand it in the narrow sense of the legacies of colonial rule. For example, the dominance of English as a language and such. That I get. But how do I see white folk as part of this colonial scene? It made no sense to me. Another thing you need to know about South Africa, we're really susceptible to words that seem to signal radical intent. We're very susceptible to that. In fact, at the school where I worked at, the principal said to me the other day, I found the perfect slogan for the reforms that we are, doing at the school. I said, what's the slogan? She said, the school's name is Cresway. She said, make Cresway great again. I said, don't even think about it, So that idea went south very quickly. So what I figured out is, when students were protesting on the campuses in South Africa, they would meet a familiar set of characters. One set of characters on the way to the Vice Chancellor of the University President's office would be the police. So the police are there to try and make sure there's no violence or whatever they do that there for. They would see the press. So there's a whole lot of people from all the newspapers, media houses trying to record these events. They would see the people, from the surrounding communities, all sort of very excited about the agitation on campus. They would, of course, see the professors, and they would all be there, some of them, joining the student protests, others, like myself, sort of saying, what the hell is going on here, before we join, and so on and so forth. What they wouldn't see is a rock-solid institution, okay, that regardless of the different people that you see is going to work very, very hard in order to make sure that radical change doesn't happen. When I say institution, I obviously don't mean the buildings and so on, and by way of campus is beautiful. I'm talking about the rules, the regulations, and the routines that keep things in place. So when you have a radical project in a state institution, the idea that you can demand change is going to happen, it doesn't work like that because of the way institutions work. So with my doctoral student, who unfortunately died unexpectedly, not doctoral, postdoc, a young single mother, her name was Cyril Walters. We then went into all of these universities, talked to everybody who wanted to talk to us, students, faculty in particular, to try and figure out why it was 3 years later, 4 years later, that nothing had changed. By their own admission, the student activists said, there's a lot of noise, nothing changed. We sort of expected that it would change, okay? Understanding why was obviously important. So these are the 7 things we found that explained the non-change on campuses in the wake of that very powerful decolonization moment. The first was institutional posturing. Now, having been both a professor and a vice chancellor, you sort of see the problem of change from different, vantage points. And what was very clear to me was that the reaction of university presidents, vice chancellors, was bizarre. They said on public platforms, particularly after roads came down, which scared the hell out of them, right? What if this also happens on our campuses? So they said to the students, we welcome the change you're proposing. I said, but I know you to be a right-wing, sort of back, why are you saying this? In my head, we welcome the change. We're going to give you money so that you can bring all those Latin American scholars of decoloniality, bring them in to the campus. There were seminars. We're closing the campus for a day so that what do you call it here in America? These
Teachings.
Teachings. You can have teachings here for the whole week. And I said, but this is ridiculous. You don't believe that, but I watch. I'm a social scientist and I'm an activist. I've got to think as a social scientist. Why is it? And all of this I'm suggesting with Cyril was institutional posturing. In the long term, they couldn't care less what happens to this powerful moment, but it helps them to pretend that they are part of the project of change. This posturing. Okay? By the way, the person who asked the best question will get a copy of the book on which this is. No pressure. It's called I'm a curriculum theorist, so we tend to sort of look at this stuff from the point of view of the curriculum. Anyway, so the first reason we expected that the change wouldn't happen is because this was simply university leaders making sure that they at least appeared to be on the side of change when in fact they had no commitment to that at all. Number two, we discovered that what academics did, what you would call faculty in this country, what they would do is to give their own meanings to decolonization. Think of this as a strange term in South Africa, right? You've never heard it before. We talked about liberation and education. We talked about post-apartheid education. We talked about education for barbarism. We never talked about decol. So they had to make up the meanings of the stuff in the absence of some operational definition. Now this is tricky in the social sciences because any term like this will have a million meanings and that's okay. But if you've never heard it before, you expect the student leaders or the faculty leaders to give some sense of what this might mean. In the absence of that kind of, those kinds of definitional things, people made up their own mind. So some people would say, I'm doing decolonization because I'm doing remediation, meaning the majority of the students are first generation students. They come from poor and working class homes. I'm going to extend the hours for my class, and here is my decolonization. And I looked at this and I said, oh my God, we're in deep trouble. Because remember, it starts off as the radical notion. By radical, I mean changing something at the roots, right? And so on. And here this person is doing good liberal, education by saying, I'm making more time for my students, I'm appointing more tutors, I'm doing the kind of stuff that remediate, or make up for, or compensates for the lack of foundational learning from the school system. Others simply said good teaching practices. I ask more questions in my class, therefore I am decolonizing. No, don't laugh. I'm sensitive as a South African, to people laughing about my country. Because I do it myself. Yes, the funny side, I didn't mean that seriously. Here's something very funny. Somebody would say, a professor of accountancy and economics at Wits University says to me, I am decolonizing by going for the low-hanging fruits. And I'm listening to this interview, I said, what do you mean? Everywhere in the textbook where I see dollars or sterling, I change it to rands. Decolonizing. And these are intelligent people, right? And because you're interviewing, you must look serious. You can't give them the sense of a mocking, fact. And I said, how the hell did we get here? You changed the sign, the dollar signs, to local currency, and you think you're decolonizing. That, I'm not even making this up. Over and over again. Somebody would say, okay, instead of talking about this particular animal, I bring in, the African rhinoceros or whatever it is. And then there were those who understood that the movement had a radical edge to it, and they would talk about critical pedagogy, which in its broadest sense would bring in the literatures of people like in this country, Michael Apple or Henry Giroux, or who have taught, I think, here at Boston University for a while. And they bring in, Fanon and Akilumbembe and great scholars, etc. But that's a minority. And so, as somebody put it, all of these references are in the book, the radical imagination was really diluted among those with greatest privilege. Then was the bureaucratization of the idea. This, for me, was the most bizarre. Okay? So, in order to ensure that academics were decolonizing their curriculum, at the University of Johannesburg, for example, they would get a once a week. We're very sensitive people. They'd get a checklist. At the top of the list was the question, did you decolonize your curriculum today? Which is imagine something as ridiculous as that, right? And then you go through, I decolonize my teaching, I decolonize my curriculum, I decolonize my assessment, I decolonize nonsense like that, okay? In other words, you were using the very tools that you were critiquing, okay, to capture what you thought was a radical move. And of course, it doesn't work like that. And so Sarah Ahmed writes beautifully on this subject in the context of diversity. You might know her work. Talks about institutional as usual, in this context. Then, what we also discovered as these protests were going on for 2.5 years, effectively, universities had to find a way of containing, and what we call disciplining knowledge from the outside, knowledge that threatens to overthrow the status quo. So how do they do this? And the best example is doctors, South African, young South African, black South Africans, trained in Cuba because of the advantage that they have of a very good health system. Okay, I have to tell those of you who are American, you often lie to about Cuba, but that's another story. They have a very good education system and they have a very good primary healthcare system. Okay, so the South African politicians, of course, hold up Cuba as this model, of a superior. So we have tertiary care. We're the country that discovered the Omicron variant in Botswana and South Africa. We're the country for which the West punished us, because Africa is the departure point for disease, not for discovery. We did the first Arthropods plot. We've got pretty good tertiary education facilities. But what you really want among the majority of the people is a very good primary healthcare system. So we send a lot of young people to train to become doctors. They learn Spanish and they go off to Cuba. When they come back, you'd imagine they would be highly regarded, except the institutions in which they had to do an additional year of both relearning medicine, medical terms in English, but also learning how to become a doctor when you're not just doing primary health care. They made sure that you snuffed out as far as you could any remnants of what happened in Cuba. In other words, you put them back in a tertiary healthcare system. And you wouldn't allow them to graduate because they had to do that additional year in South Africa unless they performed according to the standards set in the curriculum, which are regulated by external authorities. So what I'm trying to say here is when you sense any threat to the institutional curriculum, your goal is to shut it down. And no better example of how to do that than these young people who were very confused, by the way, who were told they're not good enough. The other was the regulating agencies. Now, I don't know how it works in the US. I suspect there's a similar system. You can't just come up with a new curriculum in the professions. For example, if you want to change the curriculum in accounting, there is an accrediting authority with international reference that says what counts as accounting. In medicine, you can't just change the medical school curriculum. There is another authority again with a lot of people from Canada and all over the world, that says this is what a good doctor looks like. If you want to do that for engineering, for example, etc. So, the notion that you can come up with a radical curriculum in the name of decolonization and simply have the system change is not going to happen. The problem, of course, is the protest movement lasts a year or two. It takes about 3 to 4 years before the approval goes through for a new curriculum. So what you have is a regulatory environment that makes a radical change extremely difficult to achieve. You have to go through the ringer. You have to be put through the ringer for that change to happen. So all of these things on their own are quite powerful in defanging curriculum change. Put together, they stifle, of course, any signs of radical life. You would know some of these things from your own context. Larry Cuban used this beautiful term, enclave curricula, and I love it actually. Because what you also do in universities, we're very good at that, all over the world, is if you see a sign of radical change, you put it in a corner of the campus, you make sure it has limited funding, you make sure the staff are on contracts that may or may not be. Does any of this sound familiar? Okay. In the US, the history of gender studies and African studies are very good examples of that. You're always on the edge. You don't know whether you're going to be around next year. That is by design. Okay? Anything out of the ordinary would be put there. I mean, it's quite fast. And this is what happened in South Africa as well. So when you wanted to have a center for decolonization studies, sure you can have it. But you'll be on the corner of the campus. We'll give you funding for 2 years and see what happens. And of course, the place is shut down in no time, or they remain marginal to the university's efforts. This is something I need to take some time on because you might not completely understand this initially. When this courageous woman in Australia, did you see that?
Which one?
Last week?
It was in the news like 2 days ago. With
Yeah.
The king of
England.
UK going to Australia.
Yeah.
Parliament.
Yeah.
So King Charles comes there, think to one of his territories, right? And a woman of Indigenous origins, after he made his speech, she comes up and says, "You are not my king." Is she right? Of course. You have to be very careful. You know where I realized this is when I was being prepared for these lectures I'm doing at Harvard. Do you know there's a full hour in what I was told what I can't say? Have you guys gone nuts? You can't use these words, you know, the font size for the submission must specify. What the fuck?
To be clear, that did not happen at the Center for International.
I want to challenge you. I want to put you on balance. Otherwise, go to church. But the whole idea of coming to university is anyway. I'm moving to Florida or something. So when she comes down the passage and says to the King of England, "You are not my king. You stole our land," all of which is true. Okay, and the shepherd. I could relate to that because this is true in Australia, it is true in New Zealand, it is true in Canada, and I'm so sorry to tell you guys, it is true in the United States. How white folk here behave as if they're not immigrants is beyond me. But that's another story. Okay? So here's the problem. When I work in the countries that I mentioned, particularly Australia and New Zealand, I understand what they mean by Indigenous. It's a minority of people basically being dispossessed, okay, over centuries. That I get. In South Africa, you've got to be careful with this. Because the Indigenous, first of all, is the majority. Number one, black people like myself. Number two, the meaning of Indigenous under apartheid had a particular racial and ethnic meaning And let me explain to you why. So what white people did, the apartheid government, but even before that, the colonial government, is saying there's not one black people, there's 12 black tribes. And they will all be split into Zulu, Xhosa, Sotho, Tswana, and so on. We're splitting you into your tribes. And you will have your own identity, and you will have your own culture, and you'll have your own schools, and you'll even have your own self-governing political territory. That's what apartheid is. And by the way, it's not just these black people, there's the people in the middle who are neither black nor white. We're going to call them colored, which has a very different meaning, by the way, in the US, as you know, historically. And then there's these people who came, from India, and we're going to call them Indians. So the meaning of indigenous in apartheid was a way of dividing up people and defining them in terms of some racial essence, underlying essence. We've just done two or three books actually, on how this plays out in the disciplines. So for example, a lot of my white, particularly Afrikaans, citizens believe that there is an essence to being Indian, and they would write articles and books on, for example, the fact that Indians are more likely, it's tied up in the genes actually, more likely to get these stomach pains, etc. That is a feature of being Indian. That's just between you and me. That's not a feature of being Indian. That's because you eat curry in the morning, in the afternoon, and in the evening. You are going to get all kinds of, stomach problems. One of 5 of my colleagues, actually, 2 plus students, 3 students, wrote an article in an American journal, by the way, that went through all the ethical reviews that talked about this was 4 years ago, as recently as 4 years ago, about the personalized gene and the cognitive capacities of colored women. I'm dead serious, okay? Etc., etc. In our physiotherapy department at Stellenbosch University, somebody had this bright idea to measure the pelvic strength of nulliparous women. You know what's a nulliparous woman? Somebody who's not yet given birth. Of black people, women, colored women, and African women. Just so I'm sure you all understand where this is going in terms of racial definition. Who had the strongest pelvic muscles of the 3 races? So. This brother must be thinking, man, why is he picking on me? I just came here to have a relaxing, Sorry, my brother, I apologize. So, who do you think had the strongest pelvic muscles? If you know the history of race and medicine in both our countries.
It was the black, the color,
And the whites.
and the whites. So the whites had the strongest pelvic muscle.
See me after class. Right? Remember, in racial science, women were told in both the US and South Africa over centuries that black women had a greater capacity, they were stronger, they could push out children, and therefore they don't need the kinds of medicine that might alleviate pain on childbirth. This is a long trope in racial medicine, right? So of course it found out that black women had the strongest muscles, white women not so much. This rubbish is still being put out today. So when my white Afrikaans colleagues in particular saw decolonization and gave it the meaning of indigenous, they said, no, we love this. We must pay attention to indigenous knowledge. We must pay attention, but in their heads, they are talking about this essentialized behavior of black people and so on and so on. So they never talk about indigenous in relation to white people, right? I just saw somewhere in the paper, one of your papers, the Boston Globe, that there's one school system in which all the kids will have to learn ethnic studies. Do you know what's strange about that in your country? Nobody calls white ethnic studies. It's always not white, etc. And so they weren't embarking or contributing to a radical project for curriculum change. What they are embarking on is a restatement of the apartheid logic, that there are ethnic differences that can be tied up in people's behavior, but also within their very bodies. Okay? This is dangerous stuff. Okay? And yet, they essentialize Indigenous in the name of decolonization. Okay? So that's what we found. And so we go today to any university in South Africa and you say, since 2015, has your engineering curriculum changed? Has your curriculum in immunology changed? Has your curriculum in econometrics changed? The answer is no, 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 in most of those universities, because while you have this incredibly powerful political moment with a very powerful rhetorical language around decolonization, it completely didn't reckon with what we call the institutional curriculum, whose sole function is to retain the status quo as far as epistemology and pedagogy are concerned. Want to talk more to me? There's my email. I've got a website where you'll find some of my public musings. And I've just put out a book called Breaking Bread, which is a memoir, but we'll tell you a bit of the backstory to some of the stuff that we're writing. I'm done. Talk to me. Oh, by the way, if you want to hear the story of the school, the lecture's on Thursday at Harvard somewhere. I'll send it to you. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was very interesting. One of the things I was thinking of when it comes to kind of defending radical ideas, especially in the US, we've had a lot of student movements in the past couple of years, is police violence, police force, and those sorts of things. Did that come up in any of the interviews that you conducted?
Not in the interview, because we were focused quite narrowly on the curriculum as an institution. Okay, but it did come up in the student protest movement, where they would say, "Why are the police acting, so strongly? All we're doing is sitting here and protesting," which is correct. But it's sometimes disingenuous because, again, now I'm putting on my hat as university president. If you literally set fire, this happened in South Africa, and you burn down the computer science lab, I think there's a case for the police to at least prevent that, etc. I'm not talking about normal protests and camping out and all of that stuff. So we had a very violent protest movement. It's nothing like you see now around the Gaza issue. Nothing like it. It was extremely physically violent. People got beaten up. Women got attacked by these same men who were leading this. So in that case, obviously, I'm saying, but something has changed in the world. And for those of you doing higher ed, particularly the doctoral students, master students, somebody needs to look into this, because I think something has changed, not just in the US, but all over the world. When the divestment movement happened on American campuses, I was here as a student, graduate student, you would never see what happened at Columbia. The students would camp out, they would, make a nuisance of themselves with board meetings coming by, but you would never see it. So something has changed. I mean, I couldn't believe that university presidents would be dragged through the mud in the US Congress by opportunists, political opportunists. And by the way, I also have to say the Harvard president was incredibly poorly prepared. I would have fired all the advisors. Goodness me. If somebody asks you in this heated political environment, what will happen if Jewish students get attacked? You say, there will be consequences. You might not believe in this thing. But you have to give a sense of a political savviness about you, etc. Anyway, that's off the point. Something has changed, even in South Africa. in that people are no longer tolerant of students blocking a building, sleeping out of the glass, which I think is a real problem for democracy. It's a real problem for the right to express yourself in ways that make others uncomfortable. You know, when my colleagues at Harvard said to me over lunch the other day, you know, the Jewish students said they were threatened by a flag. Are you kidding me? Who gets threatened by a flag? Right? I mean, the whole purpose of education is to unsettle you. And whether it's an Israeli flag or the old anti-apartheid flag, it doesn't unsettle me. What it does is invite me to engage with it and with the people who hold it in the way that allows for, you know, intellectual exchange. I think the world has gone crazy. I think universities have changed. If we don't understand it deeply, and somebody needs to do the hard empirical and theoretical work here to try and understand when and how the shift happened, where there's a total intolerance to activism.
Yeah, could that intolerance be perhaps rooted in like the fact that this, you know, at BC, for example, like the psychology department has a lot of like funding that's tied to Israel, and like that applied psych department is such a big part of BC, and like lots of people are proud of that department. So is it because of funding?
It is. I bet you that 80% of our explanation might lie in funding. So if you look at private universities, is Boston College private?
Yes.
It is very dependent on big money, right, from outside. And you just need your powerful donors in 1 or 2 cycles of protest to say we're putting out our money, then you have a serious problem. And the universities realize that. So you're right. You're absolutely correct. University leaders today, particularly in private university setups like here, Boston College, Harvard, and so on, we have to sort of make it. What is the balance I have to maintain here between students having the right to protest and my major funders saying they got money, and then I have to deal with staff layoffs. I have to deal with, it's always hanging there. Is it hanging there yet? The potential for staff layoffs, so this is a real problem. So I think the money is a big thing, but I think it's also other things. For example, the hardline politics you see in parts of the West, the US being a very good example. Not so much in France, for example, but certainly here. So yeah, I would certainly sniff as a researcher in looking at the financial arrangements behind our universities. Yes, sir.
In the context of the United States, I find that the defanging of radical ideas is often done by the faculty not engaging in conversations with ideas that they find challenging. So the faculty we operate in echo chambers, surrounding ourselves, reading materials, talking with people who think the same way that we think. And so I'm curious about your reaction to that. Do you see that? Do you see that in your experience, or and in the work that you're presenting with us?
Yeah.
That it's not the students, that the defanging of the radical ideas from the institution of the students, but that the faculty themselves, the people, not the administrators, the faculty playing a role in not engaging with radical ideas.
You're absolutely correct. So here's the thing. Do you have a university senate at Boston College?
No.
That's a problem. Because when you have a university senate, it is the academic conscience of the university. It is the place where these things get debated. It is the place where somebody puts October the 7th on the table and somebody else puts the genocide in Gaza on the table. It is the place in which your senior professors ask the question, what is the role of the university in the face of the Rwandan genocide at one point, or the apartheid at another point? When you don't have that, okay, now it's for those of us who would like to see more radical change in our universities, it's a tricky issue. So, for example, when your Senate at Stanford University is dominated by a Condoleezza Rice, and people from the Hoover Institute, you better believe there's going to be a strong right-wing presence in those debates. But it doesn't matter. This is a university.
Great, that's my point. Like,
Yeah.
that actually having some of that is
Yeah.
is very healthy.
Yeah, no, it is. And you fight it out. And then you have a beer afterwards. Okay, you are Jesuits. You don't. There's a beer. Yeah, okay.
Two beers.
Yeah, 2 beers. So you're absolutely correct. That's where it also. So in addition to the money, the question I would ask is, where did the academic community, by which I mean the faculty of universities, and particularly the organized faculty in the Senate, did they give up their responsibility, okay, for enabling those conversations to happen? And when it doesn't happen, it's a problem. Because what happened, and I'll tell you why it's a problem, because in the process, the nature of the university changes. Remember, we're not a church, we're not a synagogue, we're not a temple, we are a university. And that means there must be at least some space in which there could be the very rigorous engagement with ideas. And I don't think we do enough in South African universities. I don't know what happens here, that when freshmen come in, you still call them freshmen? When freshmen come in, you tell them what is a university for. Because otherwise they think of it just as another place to get a degree and get the hell out of it. That's a pity. I'll come back to you in a minute.
I wanted to ask whether or not you have looked into this whole process from the perspective of who has epistemic legitimacy, because in a sense, my research is in a different part of the world, but dealing with similar issues that you are discussing, and it feels to me that oftentimes both funders, administrators, and faculty feel that their epistemic legitimacy is being threatened by the radical ideas, and they attempt at least to appropriate them and reinterpret them in a way that you've discussed, the ideas of decolonization have been reinterpreted. So have you seen any of the, research participants engage with the issues of whether or not this movement overall is threatening their legitimacy and their careers as administrators, faculty, staff,
Good question. Fantastic question. So it's in the book, okay? But in a more nuanced way. So when George Ellis, you'll see in the book, he won the Templeton Prize. This is a dude in mathematics and who taught Hawking, the black holes guy at Cambridge. Okay, this is how. So he came out against decolonization, making that very point, and he says, "I am the expert. I know how to teach, astronomy and the mathematics of lasers, or whatever the case might be. Are you now telling me I have to give over that authority to students who come out of schools with very bad mathematics to begin with?" Part of me understands that. I don't think he feels threatened. He's too accomplished to feel threatened. But I do feel, he does feel pissed off, that your decol people are coming and saying, no, we will decide on the curriculum. He said, but you don't know enough to decide on that, okay? That part we must acknowledge. My critique of the activists is they didn't, my critique of George, first of all, is he misunderstands what they're saying. They're not saying you can't teach us. They're saying make us part of the process. They're saying broaden the perspectives, around a particular issue or topic and so on. They're saying work with us, okay? So he misunderstands it. On the other hand, the senior people involved in the activist movement didn't give, they would critique this guy. They would insult this person. You'll see it in the book. Instead of drawing in or inviting them into a discussion in which you can talk, what is the appropriate role of expertise here? And what can students contribute, okay? And other faculty to broadening the curriculum, right? For example, just take astronomy. There's a whole lot of astronomy that doesn't have its origins in the West, right? George can't see that, okay, historically. And that's the same is true for medicine, the same is true and so on. So that, I'd love to see your work as you develop it, because I think that is something we need to talk about it, but in a more nuanced way than simply good guys and bad guys.
Yeah.
Good one. Yes, ma'am.
Just quickly on your point, like sometimes I do wonder if like why we don't study how to make people with epistemic privilege more like sensitive and flexible, rather than studying like how can the people who are marginalized like do better and like catch up and like push them forward. Sometimes I think like maybe we should study the dominant group and name it and like name their problems. But like yes, I'm very excited with what you're doing.
I see a few dissertations here.
But I wanted to ask you about kind of, you know, you said earlier that you're worried when you see like exuberance and like really quick changes and really kind of, you know, like that tends to signal to you that something's wrong. And does that kind of connect to like, this might be completely wild, but I know like especially in evangelical Christianity, I also grew up, you know, Christian in a Pentecostal church.
Pentecostal?
Yeah. That like sometimes there's that kind of like exuberance and like outward celebration of your faith is sometimes privileged over like maybe like more genuine like faith and change. So did your Christian upbringing kind of inform you of that suspicion of exuberance?
I wish I had another book. No, that's a bloody good question, because you'll see it in Breaking Bread, where I explain the connection between, you know, what I believe as a scholar versus and how I have to be constantly aware. Because remember, in fundamentalism, certainly my evangelical fundamentalism, there are only right answers. And for everything there's an answer, right? And you're intolerant of people who don't believe. So white evangelical Christians make a lot of sense to me, you know, because I was there. I was there in that kind of
space.
Dangerous space where you're right and everybody else is wrong. So you're absolutely correct, and that is part of the reason why I have taught myself to be suspicious of exuberance, because what are you hiding? What am I not seeing? What are you not telling me? Is the kind of thing a scholar does. The role of a scholar is not to repeat what you hear. The role of the scholar is to ask questions about what you hear. And if you're a master's and a doctoral student, I actually don't care what answers you find. I really care about whether you can ask a good question, and I care whether you can be comfortable with uncertainty. That at its heart is what a doctoral student is about, a master's. Good questions. Wow.
Thank you for your talk.
Sure.
So I'm really curious about how you see the way forward for this decolonization discourse, because it's such a trendy topic now in social science. But my impression is that there's very little agreement on what it actually is. And your talk talked about how it's being reinterpreted and in so many different unhelpful ways. So do you see this as something that we can continue? What is the next step? To build consensus, or do we need a completely different discourse to highlight the helpful part that we're actually trying to?
Are you two friends?
Yes, of course.
Ask her to copy you the last chapter. The last chapter talks about that, because as somebody who really does believe not just in decolonization but in feminism, in ecological, there's a whole lot of stuff going on that I can't reduce the change reality to one thing. That's part of my critique of decolonization. It can't be everything, right? Because then, you know. So in the last chapter, my argument is, because we're approaching the question through the lens of institutional theory, particularly neo-institutional theory, the question is, do you understand institutions well enough? So that when the next radical moment comes along, you know how to react. In other words, you don't simply operate at the rhetorical level. You say, what keeps things in place in the institution? And then you go to those nodes. And you say, how do we unlock those things? But you can't just shout. South Africans do that and scream. And then think by demanding change you're going to get it. You won't. It's necessary, the demanding. But then you need to have smart people sit around the table and sort of say, no, how do we? So for example, when I was a university president, of course I had power that I didn't have as a dean or as a chair. And I could say to the university, we are going to have a core curriculum. And all 5,000 first-year students are going to participate. They're going to learn about astronomy, they're going to learn about human rights, they're going to learn about, so I brought in all the top professors from these different disciplines, and we said, we're going to break down this notion. This is what I learned in your country, which I found very useful, the liberal arts idea, is you can't get a guy to specialize in engineering in year one. He has not yet been educated. You can't train somebody before you educated them. He cannot have a decent conversation about anything, except, water engineering. And so, but that's because, and then I built a team around that. So what is the lesson there? You've got to go to the powers within the institution, the absent Senate that you guys mentioned, and say, how do we get structures within the university to hear us and push the change both at the level of political performance, I get that, there's a need for that, but also at the level of real change. And so the change you want happens during peacetime. Once the performances are going on, there's very little you can accomplish. And that is why, certainly in the South African Higher Education Act, it actually institutionalizes student participation in all these different. The problem is the students don't show up. So if you want to change the system, you've got to find out where the power lies. All right.
One last burning question, or
I have a last random question.
Yes.
Yes, I know.
I've been quiet and listening for a long time because I've learned some when it comes to issues like this. And the burning question was kind of asked by Bingran. It's so sad, but I wanted a way forward. What can be done to help kind of give us hope about the future, about issues like this? And she mentioned that. But I was also thinking about the sustainability of these kind of changes that we introduce into the system and how political interferences can, we can equally defang institutions also as well. So how does it happen in your case? Like the political structure of South Africa and how it affects institutions in their kind of operations like that. And they do equally affect student protests too, because I realized that I kind of read about student protests in South Africa, and I realized how political parties kind of equally find their way into where to just capitalize on what is happening to also galvanize votes and stuff like that, and it's kind of removes some realness to this kind of movement that people are pushing for. It becomes more political than we think. So how do you balance, because of your experience as a president or vice chancellor, that's what I'm asking you, how do you marry what you think should be done plus political pressure?
Yeah, so it's hard work and it's long work, right? So when I was a student in this country on the West Coast, I would go and find the 2 or 3 professors who were like-minded, who shared the idea. I would then ask them whether we could introduce a course which they had to, approve. And so with another student, we had a course on critical pedagogy, it's a school of education, and we taught that, and we brought in all the, the usual suspects, Patty Lather, all of these people to come and teach in the program. Now, the next step is the difficult one, because what you then want your university to do is to institutionalize it. In other words, for it to get official approval, so it's not just an ad hoc course done, led by students with faculty approval. That is more difficult, of course, but worth fighting for. So in every university, and I'm 100% sure in Boston College, you would find 2 or 3 or 4 faculty in every school who would be very excited if you could start a set of conversations that say, what do we need to bring to this curriculum, right? That expands our sense of the discipline, etc. That is hard work, that is long work. The problem is, of course, students come for 3-4 years and then they're gone, right? And then you need to rebuild. So you also have to think about how to do that, because what you don't want is something, it works for the time, but you don't want something that's constantly on the margins, right? Of the real stuff, of the curriculum, without finding ways of making it part of the overall curriculum. Again, read the final chapter and you'll see something.
we'll have it at CIHE. We'll have it as a revolving door. Please join me in thanking. Thank you all for coming.